For years she believed his words, that she wasn't enough, that she had lost herself, that she deserved the pain. But slowly she began to see the truth. The problem was never her. This story is not just about betrayal. It's about reclaiming identity, breaking free from emotional manipulation, and learning to see your own worth again. Because sometimes the deepest revenge isn't hurting them. It's healing yourself. Like and share to support more stories like this. Thanks for watching.
The house was completely dark, with the porch light deliberately turned off. On the coffee table, his wife's wedding ring rested next to a single sheet of paper. It contained just 5 words, but they were enough to destroy his entire world. Do not come looking for us. While he was spending Christmas Eve in Aspen with another woman, his wife had uncovered all of his secrets. She had found the secret bank accounts, the hidden apartment, and the other woman he had promised a life with. He had no idea this was coming. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply took their 8-month-old twins and vanished into the night. What she does next will leave you speechless. If you are someone who believes that karma is real and that people eventually get what they deserve, then please subscribe and follow this story to the very end. You will be glad you did. The nursery felt cold and painfully empty. Meredith Caldwell stood in the doorway, holding 2 little Christmas stockings decorated with tiny snowflakes and reindeer. Her fingers gently touched the names, Emmett and Nora, stitched in beautiful silver thread. "My sweet babies," she whispered into the silent room, her voice trembling. He did not just take away Christmas. He took away everything, and I never saw any of it coming. But that awful moment of understanding would not happen until much later. Our story truly begins on the morning of Christmas Eve, at a time when Meredith was absolutely certain that her life was perfect. The Caldwell family home in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked like it was taken from the pages of a home design magazine. A new blanket of snow covered the perfectly manicured lawn. Every window was adorned with a wreath and a velvet ribbon, in the exact shade of crimson that her mother-in-law Eleanor insisted on every single year. Inside, a giant 12-foot Christmas tree filled the living room, sparkling with lights and ornaments that the Caldwell family had passed down for 3 generations. Meredith had been awake since 5 in the morning. Now that the twins were finally sleeping through the night, she was using the quiet hours to prepare for the holiday. She baked gingerbread cookies from scratch and wrapped each present in elegant paper with flawless bows. She even set out matching pajamas for the family Christmas photo they were scheduled to take that evening. Everything had to be perfect as always. She was standing on a stepladder, making a final adjustment to the angel on top of the tree, when she sensed him behind her. Garrett was standing in the doorway, already dressed in his expensive charcoal gray business suit. His travel bag was packed and waiting by the door. He looked handsome and professional, just like he always did. "Are you leaving already?" Meredith asked, stepping down carefully. "I thought your flight was not scheduled until noon." He walked over and gave her a quick, almost businesslike kiss on her forehead, avoiding her mouth. She felt the slight, but she chose to let it go. "I decided to drive instead," he explained in a casual tone. "The weather report says the snow could get heavy later. It is just a smarter move to leave now." She just nodded, but a strange, uneasy sensation began to stir in her stomach. Garrett was a man of strict routines. He almost never changed his plans. She knew that after 6 years of marriage. "Are you sure the clients could not have moved the meeting?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from sounding upset. "It is the twins' very first Christmas, Garrett." "They will not have any memory of it, but I will," he replied with a long sigh. It was the sigh of a man who was tired of having the same conversation. "Meredith, we have already discussed this. The Henderson deal is worth $40 million in new contracts. If I can close this deal, our future is secure. I promise you, I will be back home on Christmas night." She felt a powerful urge to argue with him, She wanted to say that she had given up her own successful career for him, that she had spent the last year in a fog of exhaustion from sleepless nights. She just wanted him to be there with her and their children. But Meredith Calwell was not the type of woman to start arguments. She was the one who always smoothed things over and made life easy for everyone else. "Okay," she said, offering a faint smile. "Just please drive carefully." Garrett flashed that charming smile that had captivated her at a charity gala 7 years earlier. He cupped her face in his hands and looked into her eyes with what she believed was true love. "I will absolutely make this up to you," he promised. "We will spend New Year's in Turks and Caicos, just the four of us. I have already booked everything." She made herself smile back, letting his promise soothe her growing worry. "It is fine. Go and close your deal." He grabbed his car keys from a small table near the front door. At that very moment, his phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, quickly angled it away from her, and typed a short reply. "That is the client now," he said smoothly. "I have to take this call from the car." She watched him walk away, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Garrett," she called out just as he reached the door. He paused and glanced back at her. "I love you." A strange expression crossed his face for just a second. It might have been guilt, or maybe it was just irritation. "Love you too," he said. And then he was gone. For a long while, Meredith just stood there in the entryway. She listened to the sound of his car tires crunching on the gravel of the driveway until the noise faded away completely. The house suddenly felt enormous and empty, even with the twins sleeping soundly upstairs. She returned to the living room and straightened a Christmas ornament that was already hanging perfectly. In the dim reflection on the window pane, she saw the face of a weary woman who looked much older than her 32 years. When had that happened to her? Just then, she heard Nora begin to cry from the nursery, which pulled Meredith out of her thoughts. She rushed upstairs, grateful for the distraction. In the nursery, both babies were now fully awake. Their little faces were scrunched up, a clear sign that they were hungry. She picked up Nora first, then Emmett, and hugged them both tightly against her chest, just as she had done 1,000 times before. "Good morning, my little treasures," she whispered. "Daddy had to leave for work, but that is all right. We are going to have the most wonderful Christmas, just the three of us." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and bright, but it just came out sounding sad. As she sat in the rocking chair to feed them, her eyes landed on the family photograph on the dresser. It was from their wedding day. Garrett looked like the happiest man alive, and Meredith looked like she had won the lottery. She truly believed she had. Her phone vibrated on the small table beside her. She reached for it with her free hand, assuming it was a text message from Garrett. But it was from Suzanne, her best friend. The message read, "Merry Christmas Eve. How are my two favorite little ones doing?" Meredith typed back, "They are perfect. Garrett had to fly to Aspen for a last-minute business trip." She watched the three little dots appear and disappear as Suzanne composed her reply. A few moments later, a new message arrived. It simply said, "Aspen for work? In December?" Something about that one simple question made Meredith's stomach clench. She quickly replied, "Yes. It is a very important client meeting. You know how demanding his job can be." Suzanne's response came back almost instantly. "Of course. Give me a call when you have a free moment." Meredith set her phone down and tried to concentrate on her babies. They were feeding quietly, their tiny hands clenching and unclenching. She breathed in their sweet, milky scent and tried to push away the deeply unsettling feeling that was growing inside of her. "It is Christmas Eve," she said to herself. "My husband loves me. Everything is fine." She repeated the words over and over, like a prayer. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. But deep down, a small part of her already knew that it was not. Christmas Eve night arrived with a gentle snowfall that quieted the world outside. The house felt huge and hollow without Garrett's presence. Every small creak and groan of the old house seemed to echo in the stillness. Meredith had put the twins to bed an hour before, singing Silent Night until her throat was raw. Now she was all by herself in the living room. A glass of red wine sat untouched on the coffee table beside her. The twinkling lights of the Christmas tree cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She had tried to call Garrett 2 times, but each call went directly to his voicemail. She kept telling herself that he was probably in a long dinner meeting. She told herself he would call her as soon as he was able. She kept making up these little excuses to stop the rising sense of panic from taking over. Her laptop was on the footstool where she had left it. The screen was still open to the photo editing software she was using for their family Christmas card. Now she picked it up for a very different purpose. She wanted to upload some new photos of the twins playing in their first snow to their shared family cloud storage. Garrett's mother had been asking to see them. It was a simple, normal task, just something to keep her hands occupied while her mind was racing. She opened her laptop and navigated to the family's shared cloud drive. But something she saw on the screen made her freeze. Garrett's personal email account was still logged in from the last time he had used her computer. His private inbox was visible, showing several unread messages in bold red type. Meredith paused. In all the years they had been married, she had never once looked through his private emails. She truly believed their relationship was built on a foundation of complete and total trust. Her friend's words echoed in her mind. A business trip to Aspen, right before Christmas. With a hand that trembled, Meredith guided the mouse and clicked on his email. The very first message was a hotel confirmation. It was for a 5-star resort in Aspen. Her heart began to pound as she opened it. The reservation was for a romantic winter package made for 2 people. It was for a check-in on December 24th and a checkout on December 26th. The booking was under the name Garrett Caldwell. The second guest was listed as Vanessa Holt. Have you ever discovered a secret that shattered your entire world? If you understand that feeling, please write the word story in the comments below. The words on the screen started to swim. Meredith blinked hard, thinking she must be mistaken. She scrolled further and saw email after email, a chain of messages stretching back for months. There were reservations for intimate dinners for 2. First, she discovered online receipts for expensive jewelry from stores she did not recognize. Then, she found a rental agreement for an apartment in the city that he signed 6 months earlier. Her hands were shaking so violently that the laptop nearly slid from her legs. She set it carefully on the table, buried her face in her hands, and gasped for air, trying to understand what she was seeing. This had to be a horrible misunderstanding. Garrett would never do this to her. He loved her. But her fingers felt like they had a will of their own. She opened a new window in her browser and typed in a name, Vanessa Holt. The very first result was a professional social media page. Vanessa Holt was an executive assistant for Garrett Caldwell. Her profile picture showed a confident woman with a bright smile. She looked like she was in her late 20s and had stunning dark hair. Meredith felt her stomach plummet as she clicked on the woman's public Instagram page. The most recent post was from only a few hours ago. It showed a glass of champagne held up against a snowy mountain scene. The caption read, "Some presents are worth waiting for," followed by a diamond ring symbol. Meredith enlarged the photo. A gorgeous gold bracelet was wrapped around the woman's wrist. Meredith knew it immediately. 6 months ago, she had pointed out that exact bracelet in a jewelry store window. Garrett had told her it was much too expensive, and now, here it was, on the arm of another woman. The proof was right there, in a picture. Meredith completely forgot about the glass of wine beside her. She dove deeper and deeper into the evidence of her husband's secret life. She found statements for a credit card he had kept hidden from her, she discovered text messages that he had backed up to his email. The conversations were so personal that reading them made her feel sick to her stomach. One message from 3 weeks ago sent a chill through her entire body. He had sent it the day before Thanksgiving. A woman named Vanessa had asked, "When are you going to tell her it is over?" Garrett's reply was brutally clear. "After the holidays. I need to get my money situated first." She does not have a clue. Meredith read his words again and again until they no longer seemed real. She does not have a clue. The mountain of deception was so high that it seemed to steal all the light from her world. The secret apartment, the other woman, it was all real. With trembling hands, she dialed Garrett's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice sounding annoyed and rushed. "What is it?" "I am in a very important meeting." She could hear music and laughter in the background. She could also hear a woman's voice, though she could not understand the words. "Garrett, who is there with you?" Meredith asked, her own voice barely a whisper. "I am with my team," he snapped. "Mary, do not be so insecure. I will call you back tomorrow." Meredith pressed on. "Garrett, I really need to talk to you." He let out a loud, frustrated sigh. "Whatever it is, it can wait. I am talking with very important clients." "More important than your wife?" she wanted to scream. "More important than your children?" But the words were stuck in her throat. She heard the woman laugh again, and this time the sound was much closer to his phone. In that moment, something inside of Meredith shattered completely. "Look, I have to run," Garrett said. "Merry Christmas." And then he ended the call. Meredith sat in the crushing silence for what felt like an eternity. The colorful lights on the Christmas tree blinked with a simple, happy pulse. They were completely unaware that a life was falling apart right next to them. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. She walked upstairs and went into the nursery. The twins were sound asleep in their beds, their small faces calm and completely untroubled. Meredith collapsed onto the floor between their cribs and hugged her knees to her chest. That is when the tears began to fall. They were silent, but they would not stop. She cried until her body ached, until she had no more tears left. She cried for the life she believed she had, for the man she thought she knew. She cried for the future she had always dreamed of, which was now dissolving like a snowflake on a warm hand. When she finally finished, a new feeling took the place of sadness. It was not anger. It was a feeling of pure, cold clarity. She picked up her phone and called her friend Suzanne, who answered on the first ring. "Mary, what happened?" Meredith's voice was surprisingly steady, much calmer than she felt inside. "I need you." Garrett has been lying. He has been lying about absolutely everything. Suzanne arrived at the Grenache Chateau just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon on Christmas morning. Her car was full of supplies. Her mind, sharp and trained as a lawyer, was already running through every possibility. Neither of them had slept at all. They sat together at the kitchen table, talking in quiet voices, while the twins slept peacefully in their room. As the soft morning light of Christmas Day streamed into the kitchen, Suzanne was all business. "Show me every single thing you found." Meredith slid her laptop over to her. She had spent the entire night downloading files, taking pictures of the screen, and creating a perfect record of her husband's betrayal. This was not the Christmas she had wanted, but it would be the Christmas that finally made her free. Suzanne looked through the evidence in silence. Her expression became more and more grim with each new document she saw. There was the apartment lease and the receipts for expensive gifts. The text messages laid out a detailed plan for a new life, a life that did not include Meredith. At last, Suzanne looked up from the computer. "This is bad, Mary. This is very, very bad." "I know," Meredith said quietly. "No," Suzanne insisted. "You do not get it. These bank statements prove he is hiding assets from you, a very large amount of assets. If he is planning what I think he is planning, you need to move extremely fast. Meredith's hand tightened around her coffee cup, which was now cold. What are you saying? Suzanne leaned forward. Men like Garrett do not just leave. They have an exit strategy. They make sure they get it all. By the time the wife realizes what is happening, all the money is gone. The prenup is airtight, and she walks away with nothing at all. Meredith spoke softly. We did not sign a prenuptial agreement. He said he trusted me too much for that. Suzanne let out a short, harsh laugh. Of course he did. He knew exactly what that meant. A prenup would have offered you some basic protections. Without one, he can try to take every last penny in the divorce. But it also means you have a right to half of everything, but only if you can prove that it exists. Meredith could only stare at the mountain of proof on her screen. So, what do I do? Suzanne answered immediately. You have to leave, today, right now, before he comes home and realizes that you are on to him. Leave? Where would I go? Meredith asked, her voice trembling. My family has a cabin in Vermont. It has been sitting empty for years. There is no paperwork linking you to that place, and nobody outside of our family even knows it is there. Meredith slowly shook her head. I cannot just grab the twins and run away. That is kidnapping. It is not kidnapping when you are their mother and there is no court-ordered custody plan. You have every legal right to take your children wherever you want. What you do not have, Suzanne said with force, is time. Those words hung heavy in the air. Meredith looked around the beautiful kitchen, a room she had designed herself. She looked at the custom wood cabinets. She looked at the marble counters and the professional-grade stove. She had poured her heart into making this house a home, only to learn that it was never really hers. If I leave, she said in a low voice, everything will be different. I can never come back to this house. Suzanne reached across the table and took her hand. Do you honestly want to come back? Do you want to be with a man who lied to your face for months? A man who has another woman living in an apartment that you unknowingly helped pay for? Meredith saw Garrett's face in her mind. She thought of the champagne and the bracelet. She remembered how irritated he had sounded on the phone. He had spoken to her as if she were an annoying problem he needed to solve. No, she whispered. I do not want to come back. Good. Then we need to get started, Suzanne said. They moved quickly and with a clear plan. Meredith packed only the essentials, following a very specific list that Suzanne provided. Birth certificates, passports, social security cards, the twins' health records. The only personal thing she brought was her grandmother's jewelry, the one thing that was hers alone. She left behind all of her clothes and all of the family photos. She took only what she needed to build a new life. Suzanne handled all of the logistics. She had Meredith withdraw a large amount of cash from her personal bank account at an ATM. She moved money through a bank account that Garrett had never even noticed. At a small, quiet gas station, she bought a disposable phone that could not be traced. She mapped out a new future for her family, a route that stuck to winding back roads where it would be difficult for anyone to follow them. After she put the very last bag into the car, Meredith paused in the doorway of her living room. The Christmas tree was still glowing, its tiny lights blinking in a cheerful, never-ending loop. By the fireplace, their stockings were hung and waiting, and the presents she had wrapped so perfectly sat in a bright pile. She walked over to the coffee table and slowly slid off her wedding band. She placed the gold ring on the dark surface of the wood. Then she tore a page from a notepad and wrote down just 6 simple words. Do not try to find us. She left the note right beside her ring and walked out of the room without looking back. Once in the car, she gently buckled her sleepy twins into their car seats. As she pulled his harness tight, Emmett reached out and playfully grabbed for her finger. Nora gave a little yawn and then drifted back to sleep. Meredith leaned over and placed a soft kiss on each of their foreheads. We are going on a new adventure, she whispered to them. From now on, It is just going to be the three of us." She climbed into the driver's seat and looked at Suzanne. "Are you positive about this cabin?" Suzanne gave her a firm nod. "I am sending you the location right now," Suzanne told her. "Get rid of your old phone. Do not call anyone from your past. I will handle everything on this end." Meredith gave her a small nod. "Thank you for making this possible." "You can thank me later, when you are finally safe and truly free," Suzanne answered. Meredith turned the key, and the engine of the car rumbled to life. She took one last look at the house she had considered home for the past 4 years. It was a perfect house for a perfect life, but all of it had been a beautiful and painful lie. She shifted the car into drive and disappeared into the gray light of Christmas morning. She was leaving behind everything she knew, except for the 2 small children who meant everything to her. Just as she drove off, a fresh layer of snow began to fall quietly from the sky. It quickly covered her tire tracks, erasing any sign that she had ever been there. Garrett Caldwell returned home on Christmas evening to a completely dark house. The first thing he saw was that the porch light was out. Meredith always made sure to leave it on for him. It was one of her small, thoughtful habits, a tiny detail she always remembered, even though he never gave it a second thought. But on that night, the entrance was dark and unwelcoming. A deep sense of worry washed over him as he pulled his car into the driveway. His private flight from Aspen had been very turbulent. The winter storm had violently thrown the small jet around in the sky. During the entire trip, Garrett had been fighting a headache from too much champagne while thinking about his weekend. Vanessa had been disappointed that he had to go home so soon. She had begged him to stay with her until the new year, but maintaining a certain public image was very important. Garrett Caldwell was a man who cared a great deal about appearances. He used his key to open the front door and stepped inside. In the living room, the Christmas tree was still lit up. Its bright lights cast dancing shadows on the walls of the silent home. "Meredith," he shouted, "I am home." But the only reply he received was complete silence. He set his travel bag down by the door and walked further into the living room. At first, everything seemed to be in perfect order. The holiday decorations were hung precisely, the gifts were stacked neatly beneath the tree, and the sofa cushions were arranged just right. Then his gaze fell upon the coffee table. Her wedding band was sitting there, beside a folded piece of paper, sparkling under the colorful lights of the tree. Garrett's hands began to tremble as he reached for the note. "Do not try to find us." He read the words over and over, but they did not feel real. The paper slipped from his fingers as he bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The nursery was empty. The 2 cribs stood there like silent accusations. The blankets on the little beds were folded perfectly, but the babies who should have been sleeping in them were gone. Garrett yanked open the dresser drawers and found they were only half full of clothes. The diaper bag was missing. The baby carriers were also gone. He quickly grabbed his phone to call Meredith. It rang one time before going directly to her voicemail. He tried a second time and got the same result. His hand was shaking as he scrolled through his contacts, looking for his mother's number. Eleanor answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. "Garrett, what is the matter?" He could hardly get the words out. "She is gone." "Meredith," he managed to say, his voice breaking. "She took the twins, and she is gone." A short silence hung in the air before Eleanor's tone turned as cold as ice. "What are you talking about? She is gone?" "I got home, and the house was empty. She left her wedding ring on the table, with a note telling me not to look for her. The babies are gone." "I understand," Eleanor said, her voice like the cold winter wind. "Garrett, what did you do?" "I did not do anything. I have no idea why she would just leave like this." "Do not lie to me," she snapped back. "I am not your naive little wife." Garrett collapsed onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. He thought about the emails and the text messages, the evidence he was so sure he had hidden. "She knows. he finally admitted. She found out about Vanessa. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and absolute. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was cold enough to freeze water. "You are an unbelievable fool. I warned you about that woman." "I had everything under control." "Obviously you did not. Do you have any clue where Meredith might have gone?" Garrett's thoughts were a chaotic mess of panic. Her parents had passed away, and she did not have very many friends. Suzanne Brennan was her maid of honor. But he could not remember the last time Meredith had even said her name. "Maybe Suzanne," he suggested. "They were close friends in college." "Then you need to locate this Suzanne and find out what she knows," his mother commanded. "I will start to make some calls. We need to get this situation handled before it becomes a public embarrassment." Garrett nodded, even though she could not see him. A new emotion was starting to build inside his chest. It was not guilt, and it was not regret. It was a hot, blinding anger. How could she do this to him? How could she take his children and just run away before he had a chance to explain, before he could fix everything? He had given her a perfect life, a beautiful home, a respected place in society, and a world of endless comfort. And this was how she repaid him. "Mother," he said, his voice becoming cold and firm, "I want them located and brought home. Do whatever you have to do." Eleanor's reply was immediate and certain. "I have contacts, people who are very skilled at what they do. We will handle this." After he hung up, Garrett sat by himself in the quiet nursery. He was surrounded by toys and furniture for a family that had just vanished. Above Emmett Gowett's crib, a small mobile spun slowly in the air, and its soft, tinkling melody made his jaw clench in anger. He picked up his phone to make another call. Vanessa answered, her voice sounding a little out of breath. "Darling, I was not expecting you to call until tomorrow." "Things have changed," Garrett said in a flat tone. "She knows," Garrett said plainly. "She took the kids and she left." There was a short pause on the line. "Oh my goodness, what are we going to do?" "You are not going to do anything," he told her. "You will stay completely out of this and allow me to manage my own family business. Is that clear?" "Yes, of course. Anything you say." Garrett ended the call without saying goodbye. He went back downstairs and poured a large glass of scotch, drinking the entire thing in one long, burning gulp. Meredith actually believed she could escape from him. She thought she could take his children and just disappear, as if he were some ordinary man she could just walk away from. She was making a terrible mistake. Garrett Caldwell did not lose. He did not lose in business, he did not lose in his personal life, and he was definitely not going to lose his own marriage. He picked up his phone to make one final call. This time, it was to a man who specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. "I need your services," he said. "My wife has disappeared with our children. I need you to locate her within 48 hours. The man on the other end of the phone told him the price. Garrett did not hesitate. "Done. I will pay whatever it costs." He hung up the phone and stared at the Christmas tree. In the middle of his perfect life, now in pieces, its cheerful lights seemed to be mocking him. She was going to learn a very painful lesson. In his world, they all did. No one ever just walks away from Garrett Caldwell. The cabin in Vermont was located at the end of a long dirt road that had not seen a snowplow in weeks. A thick wall of snow completely blocked the driveway, which meant Meredith had to park the car almost 50 yards away from the cabin. She had to carry her babies one by one through snowdrifts that were as high as her knees. By the time she finally had both of them safely inside, her legs were shaking and her lungs ached from the freezing air. But the cabin was solid, it was warm, and most importantly, it was safe. It had been in Suzanne's family for 3 generations. It was a simple, rustic cabin with no internet and almost no phone signal, but it did have running water and a working fireplace. The pantry had enough food to last for weeks, but Meredith barely noticed. She gently set the twins down on an old soft couch and looked at the beginning of her new life. The first 3 days were a complete blur. Her entire world was a cycle of feeding the babies, long, sleepless nights, and a tiredness so deep she could hardly think. She kept all the curtains closed, jumped at every unfamiliar sound, and double-checked the locks before she even tried to rest. But after a few days, something inside her started to shift. On the fourth morning, a small beam of sun peeked through the curtains, and she woke up to the sound of Emmett giggling in his crib. Nora was awake as well, happily cooing to herself as she stared at the ceiling. Meredith stayed in bed for a moment, just listening to the sweet sounds of her children. For the first time in what seemed like forever, in this quiet little cabin, she felt a feeling she had almost forgotten. She felt peace. Later that day, Suzanne showed up in a car filled with groceries and a huge stack of legal papers. She kicked the snow from her boots and gave Meredith a long, comforting hug before saying a single word. "You look better," she finally said. "You do not look like you have seen a ghost anymore." "I feel better," Meredith answered. "It is strange. I was so scared I would completely fall apart when I got here." Suzanne set a thick pile of folders on the kitchen table. "That is because you have been slowly falling apart for years," she said gently. "You just did not notice it because you were trying so hard to hold everything else together." They sat at the table while the twins napped and spread the papers across the plain wooden top. It was clear that Suzanne had been working very hard. There were statements from secret bank accounts, deeds for properties Meredith did not know about, and proof of financial crimes that were much worse than his affair. "He has been moving money to overseas accounts for more than a year," Suzanne explained. "He is using fake companies in the Cayman Islands to make investments that do not show up on any of your shared financial records. If he ever filed for divorce, he would claim to be broke, and you would end up with next to nothing." Meredith could only stare at the numbers on the pages. "How much money are we actually talking about?" "Our best estimate is somewhere between $12 and $15 million, and every penny of it is hidden." The amount of money was staggering. Meredith knew they were comfortable, but she never imagined they had that kind of wealth. "There is something else," Suzanne said, and her voice became very serious. "I looked into Vanessa Holt. She is not just his assistant. She has been receiving money from his secret account for 3 years, and her salary is way too high for a normal job." "What are you trying to say?" Meredith asked. "I am saying he pays her for a lot more than just organizing his calendar. I also found a lease for an apartment in her name. It seems like she has been waiting for him to leave you for a very long time." A cold, sick feeling spread through Meredith's stomach. She thought of all the nights he claimed to be working late. She remembered all of his business trips. She had given him all her trust, and he had used it as a tool to deceive her. "So what is our next step?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We build our case," Suzanne said firmly. "We document absolutely everything. Then, when the moment is right, we will absolutely crush him in court." For the first time since that terrible night, Meredith felt a brand new emotion. A small, hot flame of anger started to burn inside of her. She looked down at the pile of evidence on the table, and then she looked up at her friend, Suzanne. "Just tell me what to do." They spent hours organizing the documents and planning their next moves. Suzanne calmly explained all of the legal options. She used simple words that Meredith could understand, explaining divorce petitions, how to find hidden money, and custody fights. By the time they finished, the sun had set. The twins were awake and crying for their dinner. Meredith fed the babies, while Suzanne made a simple meal from the canned food in the pantry. Much later that night, the children were sound asleep, and a fire was crackling in the fireplace. They sat together in the quiet darkness. "I honestly thought I would miss him," Meredith admitted in a low voice. "This house, the life we built. But I feel nothing at all." You missed the dream of what you wanted it to be, Suzanne replied softly, not the reality of what it was. Meredith nodded her head. I keep remembering all the warning signs I chose to ignore. I remember all the times I told myself I was just being crazy or ungrateful. That was not your fault, Suzanne said with force. He was a professional liar. They sat quietly for a minute. Then Suzanne spoke again. You know he is searching for you, right? His mother has very powerful friends and a lot of money. I know, Meredith whispered. Does that scare you? Meredith considered the question. She saw Garrett's face in her mind and the cold, empty expression in his eyes. She thought about his mother, a woman who had never liked her and always made her feel small. Yes, she finally said, but the thought of going back scares me a lot more. Good, Suzanne said. Hold on to that feeling. Outside, the snow began to fall, covering the world in a silent, white blanket. Meredith looked at her children, sleeping soundly in the crib that Suzanne had built. For the very first time, she let herself imagine a future that did not have Garrett Caldwell in it. The idea was frightening, but it was also thrilling. It felt like freedom. She whispered into the silent room, "We are going to be okay." In that exact moment, the silence was shattered. The low roar of car engines grew louder and louder. Bright headlights sliced through the dark, sweeping across the bedroom ceiling, like spotlights searching for someone on the run. Meredith's new feeling of hope instantly turned to ice. They had found her. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a drum. She grabbed her phone to call Suzanne, and her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold it. "They are here," she managed to say, but Suzanne's voice was completely calm. "I know, Meredith. I made a call too. A friend of mine from the state police is on his way there now to perform a wellness check. Just stay inside." A few seconds later, there was a loud knock on the front door. Meredith peeked through the curtains and saw a police officer in a full uniform. He was speaking to two scary-looking men who were standing by a black sport utility vehicle. The officer's presence was a shield. The men argued, but they had no power. They finally got into their car and drove away in defeat. The very next morning, Garrett was served with divorce papers. He was also given a restraining order that froze all of his bank accounts and properties. His perfect world fell apart in an instant. Meredith had not just run away, she had won. Many months later, in a bright new house far from her old life, she watched her twins playing happily on the floor. They were finally safe, and they were finally free. She realized then that she had found the strength inside herself to build a wonderful new life from the ruins of her old one. The phone rang once, then a second time, then a third time before going to voicemail. She tried calling again. Her fingers were trembling so badly that the phone almost slipped from her grasp. The same thing happened. Outside, she could see shapes moving toward the cabin. The beams from their flashlights cut through the darkness like sharp blades. Meredith counted 4 of them. 2 of the men wore police uniforms, and the other 2 were in street clothes. She could hear the crunch of their boots on the frozen snow. Every sound was like another spike of fear hammered into her heart. She guessed she had maybe 3 minutes. She raced over to the twins, who were still fast asleep in their cribs. She tried to solve an impossible puzzle about how to get away. The cabin had no back door. There was no other exit. None of the windows were big enough for her to climb through while holding 2 babies. Every possible way out led straight to the men who were coming to get her. Think. You have to think. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find an answer that did not exist. She could hide in the closet, but they would discover her in seconds. She could refuse to open the door, but they would simply break it down. There was no way to fight 4 men, especially when 2 of them were armed. A loud, heavy knock exploded through the little cabin, sounding like a gunshot. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is the police. We need you to open the door." Meredith was frozen in place in the center of the room. She was holding her babies tightly against her chest. She could only take short, terrified breaths. Emmett moved against her, bothered by the frantic beating of her heart. Nora made a small cry in her sleep. Meredith knew she had nowhere to run. She knew she had nowhere to hide. The only thing she could do now was wait. Another knock came, even louder than the first. "Mrs. Caldwell, we know that you are in there. Open this door right now, or we will have to force our way in." Meredith walked very slowly toward the door. Each step felt like she was walking to her own doom. Meredith cradled the twins in the curve of one arm. Her free hand was shaking so violently that turning the doorknob felt like an impossible task. When the cabin door finally creaked open, her mother-in-law, Eleanor Caldwell, was the first to enter. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat and an expression of cold triumph. Even in the dead of night, her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. She was the picture of a woman who had never experienced a single day of struggle. Behind her stood two police officers with neutral, businesslike faces, along with a large man Meredith did not recognize. He had a shaved head and cold, vacant eyes. He surveyed the small cabin with the practiced air of someone skilled at finding things that did not want to be found. "Did you truly imagine you could hide from us?" Eleanor asked, her voice thick with contempt. "In this little cabin owned by the parents of an old college friend? It took us only 3 days to locate you, Meredith. Just 3 days. Did you sincerely believe you could outwit this family?" Meredith hugged her babies closer, feeling the warmth of their little bodies as her only source of comfort. "How did you find me?" Eleanor smiled, a cruel line that resembled the edge of a blade. "Money, my dear. Money can find anyone, and it can find anything. My son has already been awarded emergency custody of the children. These officers are simply here to ensure you comply with the judge's order." "A judge's order? What are you talking about? I have not been served with any legal papers." One of the officers took a step forward, holding out a folded document. His badge gleamed in the dim lighting. "Mrs. Caldwell, a judge has signed an emergency custody order in favor of your husband. It is based on concerns for your mental state and the welfare of the children. You have 72 hours to make an appearance in a Connecticut courtroom." "My mental state?" Meredith's voice trembled and broke. "That is ridiculous. I am their mother. I have never done a single thing to harm them." "A mother who flees in the middle of the night with her newborn twins?" Eleanor countered, her voice smooth and sharp. "A mother who abandons her home without a word to anyone, who brings her children to a remote cabin, cutting them off from the world. That is not the conduct of a stable individual, Meredith. That is the conduct of a person in the middle of a severe mental crisis." "I discovered he was having an affair," Meredith shouted, struggling to keep her composure as her voice grew louder. "He has been seeing another woman for months. He has been hiding our family's money. His whole life is a complete lie. I left to keep myself safe and to keep my children safe." Eleanor did not so much as blink. Her expression remained perfectly composed and unbothered. "You see, officers, this is precisely what I mean. She is suffering from paranoid delusions. She believes everyone is conspiring against her. This is exactly what we outlined in our court documents." The large man with the shaved head then spoke for the first time, his voice flat and mechanical. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Frank Donovan. I am a private investigator hired by your husband. This does not have to be difficult. If you cooperate and return with us, we can allow the legal system to do its work." Meredith's gaze shifted from the investigator to the officers and finally back to Eleanor. She scanned their faces, desperate for any flicker of compassion or empathy. But there was none to be found. She saw only cold, unwavering confidence. She saw the total certainty of people who knew they had won the battle long before it ever began. "Do I have another option?" she whispered. "You have 72 hours to be present in that Connecticut courtroom," the officer stated again. "If you fail to appear, a warrant will be put out for your arrest. Your children will stay in their father's custody until the hearing." In that one moment, Meredith felt her entire world crumble. Everything she had been fighting for over the last week was gone. The safety she had managed to find, the small flame of hope she had guarded, the slim possibility of freedom. It all vanished. Eleanor moved closer to her. The scent of her expensive perfume was so overpowering it was hard to breathe. Her voice fell to a venomous whisper, meant only for Meredith's ears. "If you come back home without a fuss, Garrett may decide to show you some leniency. But if you cause a scene, if you drag our family name through the mud, I give you my word. I will see to it personally that you never lay eyes on these babies again. Do you understand me?" Meredith looked down at her sleeping children, Emmett and Nora. They were so blissfully unaware of the storm that was raging around them. They had no idea that their lives were being used as leverage by people who viewed them as possessions. For a brief second, she considered fighting. She pictured herself bolting out the back door, screaming for help until someone, anyone, would listen. But she knew it was pointless. The Caldwell's fortune could buy anything and everything. Meredith had absolutely nothing. "Fine," she said, the single word feeling like she was swallowing broken glass. "I will go back." A grotesque, triumphant smile slowly spread across Eleanor's face. "I was certain you would see reason. You were always such an intelligent girl." Meredith felt a deep numbness as an officer stood by and watched her pack a small bag. Donovan, the investigator, carried her belongings to their large black vehicle. Eleanor fussed over the twins as if they were new trophies she had just acquired. But in that moment, Meredith made a silent vow to herself. This was not over. She had lost this fight, but the war was far from finished. She would burn their entire world to ashes to get her children back. The Greenwich family courthouse was a bleak, gray structure with tall windows that seemed to gaze down with judgment. On that bitter January day, the American flags outside were perfectly still. Inside, the sound of shoes echoed on the marble floors, blending with the low hum of hushed, serious talks. The air carried the scent of old paper and harsh cleaning chemicals. Meredith sat on a hard bench outside courtroom 3, wringing her hands in her lap. Her lawyer and best friend Suzanne sat beside her, flipping through the legal documents. Her expression grew darker with each page. "This is a complete setup," Suzanne whispered. "The judge, Harrison Webb, has been a friend of the Caldwell family for 30 years. He was a guest at their wedding. He is required to recuse himself." "He will not," Meredith replied, her voice flat and devoid of hope. "They have planned for everything. I can still file a motion to have him removed. And he will just deny it. Then we will appeal his denial." "Using what money, Suzanne? I do not have a single dollar. Garrett has put a freeze on all of my bank accounts and credit cards." Suzanne stared at her friend, her eyes wide. For the first time since this nightmare began, Meredith saw genuine fear on her lawyer's face. It was the expression of someone who is finally grasping the true extent of their opponent's power. Just then, the large courtroom doors swung open. A bailiff announced their case number. Meredith felt her legs turn to jelly as she rose and entered the room that would determine the rest of her life. The room was small and felt claustrophobic. Garrett was already seated with his lawyer at the opposing table. His attorney was a woman named Pamela Thornton, whose reputation for being ruthless was a formidable weapon on its own. She was famous for dismantling her opponents in court with chilling precision. Garrett refused to even look in Meredith's direction. He just stared forward, sitting perfectly composed, playing the part of a devoted husband who had been wronged. His mother, Eleanor, sat directly behind him. She observed Meredith with the unsettling contentment of a predator toying with its prey. And next to Eleanor, dressed in an elegant and professional outfit, was Vanessa Holt. The sight of her nearly caused Meredith's legs to buckle. She could not process it. The other woman was actually present in the courtroom, there to watch her fight for her own kids. She wore her affair with Garrett as if it were a medal of honor. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Webb. The judge entered. He was an older man with white hair and steel-rimmed glasses. His expression made it clear that he had formed his opinion long before taking the bench. He gave a small, familiar nod to Pamela Thornton before his gaze flickered briefly toward Meredith. We are here today to consider the emergency custody motion filed by Mr. Garrett Caldwell concerning his two children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell. Miss Thornton, you may proceed. Pamela rose, her voice polished and self-assured. Your Honor, my client is gravely concerned for the welfare of his children. On December 25th, his wife, Meredith Caldwell, deserted their family home in the dead of night. She took the children to an undisclosed location and made no attempt to contact anyone. Meredith felt a scream building in her chest. She wanted to leap to her feet and tell everyone the truth about the cheating, the secret bank accounts, and all the deception. But Suzanne placed a firm hand on her arm, a silent command to remain seated. We have also acquired a psychiatric evaluation. Pamela held up a file folder as she spoke. It suggests that Mrs. Caldwell may be suffering from postpartum psychosis. The evaluating physician, Dr. Robert Matthews, is prepared to testify. He will state that her recent behavior is consistent with delusional thinking and that she may pose a risk to her children. Meredith leaned toward Suzanne, whispering urgently, I have never even heard of that doctor before. I am aware, Suzanne whispered back. We are going to challenge this. But when Suzanne stood to object, Judge Webb simply gave a dismissive wave of his hand, cutting her off. The evaluation was conducted out of Mr. Caldwell's profound concern for his children's safety. Adolfoirtoile, the hour that followed was a living nightmare, built on a foundation of twisted truths and outright lies. Vanessa approached the witness stand, identifying herself as Mr. Caldwell's executive assistant. With tears welling in her eyes, she described how Meredith's conduct had grown more and more bizarre over the past year. She seemed so paranoid, Vanessa stated, her voice thick with false concern. She would accuse Mr. Caldwell of the most unbelievable things. I even witnessed her having tantrums at company functions. All Meredith could do was stare at the woman who was sleeping with her husband. This woman was now committing perjury to help steal Meredith's children, and a cold dread washed over Meredith. When her attorney, Suzanne, tried to present evidence of the affair, Judge Webb cut her off. He declared, This is a custody hearing, Mrs. Brennan, not a divorce proceeding. Mr. Caldwell's private life has no bearing on the children's welfare. Suzanne pushed back. Your Honor, his profound dishonesty speaks volumes about his character and his fitness as a parent. The judge's response was swift. Objection sustained. Move on. But there was nothing left to move on to. Every piece of evidence Meredith had painstakingly gathered was either dismissed or completely ignored. Every argument Suzanne tried to present was immediately shut down. It was painfully obvious that the verdict had been decided long before they ever stepped into the courtroom. The judge delivered his ruling with a cold and efficient cruelty. Based on the testimony and evidence presented, Judge Webb announced, I am awarding temporary sole custody of the children to their father, Mr. Garrett Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell will be granted supervised visitation twice a week pending a full custody hearing. No, Meredith gasped, rising to her feet. No, you cannot do this. He is lying. They are all lying. The judge's tone was sharp. Mrs. Caldwell, compose yourself, or I will have you removed from my courtroom. Please, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Please do not take them. They are my babies. I am their mother. But her words were useless. Two bailiffs were already moving toward her. Garrett was standing up, and his mother, Eleanor, was already collecting the twins, who were still in their infant carriers. Meredith watched in absolute horror as the architects of her ruin carried her children away. Her daughter, Nora, looked back over Eleanor's shoulder. Her tiny face was creased with confusion as she reached a small hand out for her mommy. Meredith collapsed against Suzanne, a broken, agonized sound tearing from her throat. She was utterly defeated. They had stripped her of everything she loved, and she was powerless to stop it. The motel room reeked of stale cigarette smoke and despair. The wallpaper curled away from the corners like dry, peeling skin. The carpet was a collage of stains that Meredith tried her best to ignore. On the ceiling, a large brown water spot spread out like a map to some miserable, forgotten land. But the room cost only $39 a night, and she was down to her last $847. It had been 3 weeks since that devastating day in court. 3 weeks of seeing her children in sterile, featureless rooms under the hum of fluorescent lights. For 2 hours at a time, she would sit on a hard plastic chair and hold her babies, while a court-appointed monitor documented her every move. She had survived 3 agonizing weeks in cash-only motels that never asked for identification. For 3 weeks, her diet consisted of snacks from gas stations and bitter coffee from vending machines. She frantically tried to figure out her next move, but every path she considered was a dead end. Garrett's lawyers had been ruthlessly efficient. They had successfully frozen their joint bank accounts, claiming she was a flight risk who might drain their funds. They had obtained a restraining order that barred her from her own home. They argued the house was a marital asset, now tied up in the divorce litigation. They even twisted her desperate flight with the children into an argument against her, claiming that crossing state lines proved she was an unstable parent. They had systematically dismantled her life, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And just today, she had received the most crushing news of all. Meredith sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at the legal documents Suzanne had emailed her that morning. The ripped open envelope lay on the nightstand. Its pages were spread across the faded bedspread, like evidence from a grim crime scene. The one person who could have saved them, Garrett's former secretary Tina Marshall, had turned against them. She had completely reversed her story in a new sworn statement. In this new version, she claimed Meredith had offered her a bribe to lie about Mr. Caldwell. The document was official, and it was a death blow to their case. "He paid her off," Suzanne had said, over the phone, her voice hollow. "I do not know how much he gave her, but it was enough. She was our only credible chance to expose him for the monster he is." Meredith asked, "What about the federal investigation?" "It is stalled," Suzanne replied. "Judge Webb is remaining on the case, and our formal complaint against him is going nowhere. Meredith, he has friends in very high places. I have never seen anything like it." "So what do I do now?" Meredith asked. A long, heavy pause hung in the air. "I do not know," Suzanne finally admitted. "I am out of moves. I am so sorry." After hanging up, Meredith sat in the silence for a long time. Outside her window, the world continued on as if her life had not just been shattered. Cars sped down the highway, their headlights slicing through the gathering dusk. Across the street, a diner's neon sign flickered on. It advertised fresh coffee and pie. In another universe, people were living their ordinary lives. They were worrying about normal things. They were hugging their children without a stranger taking notes. She picked up her phone and opened a news app, her thumb scrolling past headlines she did not register. But then, an article at the top of the feed made her stomach clench. The title read, "Caldwell Capital Post's record-breaking sales quarter announces expansion." The story featured a photo of Garrett at a press conference. He stood at a podium bearing his company logo, looking powerful, rich, and completely untroubled by the wreckage he had caused. His suit was perfectly tailored. His smile was wide and confident. He looked like a man who had never known a day of hardship in his life. And standing right beside him was Vanessa. Her hand rested on a tiny baby bump, barely visible beneath her designer dress. She had that radiant glow of an expectant mother. It was the same glow Meredith once had, before her entire world was ripped apart. The caption below the photo read, "Caldwell, with fiancée Vanessa Holt, who are expecting their first child." Meredith's eyes locked onto those words. Expecting their first child, their first child. It was as if her own children, Emmett and Nora, had been erased from existence. It was as if they were just an inconvenient footnote in Garrett's life story, instead of the center of hers. She pictured her babies sleeping in Eleanor's house. Nannies were giving them their bottles. Strangers were rocking them to sleep. She thought of the 2 hours a week she was permitted to see them, always supervised, always under a microscope. It was never, ever enough. For one fleeting moment, she considered giving up completely. Her phone suddenly buzzed, shaking her from her dark thoughts. The call was from an unknown number. She almost ignored it. What was the point? It was probably more bad news. Another professional telling her it was hopeless. Another reminder that men like Garrett always win. She was just a pawn in his world. But something made her slide her thumb across the screen to answer. "Is this Meredith Caldwell?" a woman's voice asked. It was cautious and unfamiliar, with a slight echo as if calling from a large, empty room. "Who is this?" Meredith responded. "My name is not important at the moment," the woman said, "but I have some information that I think you will find very interesting. Look, if this is another reporter looking for a scoop, I am not interested. I have nothing more to say." "I am not a reporter, Mrs. Caldwell," the woman replied. "I am someone who has been exactly where you are now. I am a survivor of Garrett Caldwell." Meredith felt the air leave her lungs. Her grip on the phone was so tight her knuckles turned white. "What are you saying?" she whispered. There was a short pause. When the woman spoke again, her voice was softer, laced with the pain of old wounds. "Check your email. I sent you something that will change everything. But you need to be extremely careful. He has eyes and ears everywhere. He always does. How did you get my number?" "Who are you?" Meredith pressed. "I am someone he could not erase," the woman stated. "Read the email. Then you can call me back." The line went dead. Meredith sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not stop her hands from trembling as she opened her email. A new message was sitting right at the top. The email had no subject line and no message inside. There was only a single file attached, with one sentence below it. The sentence read, "He did the same thing to me. You are not losing your mind. You are not alone." With a shaky finger, she tapped the screen to open the file. The first thing she saw was a medical document from 4 years ago. It was an order to commit a woman named Colleen Mercer to a mental health hospital. Her husband, Garrett Mercer, was the one who had her put there. He claimed she was deeply depressed and seeing things that were not real. It was an involuntary commitment. Meredith felt as if her heart had just stopped beating. Garrett had been married before. Eleanor had told her that once. Eleanor had mentioned it only one time, years ago, during a calm family dinner. She spoke of a short marriage that ended when his first wife died in a horrible car accident. The whole thing was so tragic, Eleanor had said back then. But some people are simply not built to handle this life. But the truth was, Colleen Mercer had not died in a car crash at all. These documents showed that her husband had locked her away in a mental institution. She was held there against her will for 6 months. They gave her drugs and completely isolated her from everyone she had ever known. She was only let go after she signed a large pile of legal papers. In those papers, she gave up all of her marital assets and promised to never contact Garrett or his family ever again. The very moment those papers were signed, She seemed to vanish completely. Meredith scrolled down through the other files, feeling sicker with each page she viewed. She saw hospital charts that described treatments Colleen had never consented to. She found statements from secret bank accounts that he had kept hidden. There were court filings that a judge had ordered to be sealed and hidden from the public forever. And then she found a letter Colleen had written to her sister. It was a digital copy of a message that was never sent. The letter said, "He convinced everyone that I was insane. He paid doctors to back up his lies, found judges who owed him favors, and hired lawyers who would do anything for money. I did not realize what was happening until it was far too late. He had stripped away everything I had. He took my money, my reputation, my freedom, and even my own identity. If you are reading this, it means I finally found a way to escape. I am begging you, please do not let him do this to anyone else." Meredith's eyes focused on the date on the documents. They were dated 4 years ago. Colleen Mercer had gotten away from Garrett Caldwell. She had survived. She had started a new life from the ruins of the one he had destroyed. And if Colleen was able to do that, Meredith knew that she could do it too. She picked up her phone and dialed the mysterious number. A woman answered on the very first ring. "I am ready to listen," Meredith said. For the first time in what felt like forever, her own voice sounded strong and steady. "Please tell me your whole story," Meredith said. The woman on the phone now used the name Catherine. She had chosen that name for herself to begin her new life. She had left the name Colleen Mercer in the past, along with everything else that her former husband, Garrett, had ruined. She explained that she lived a quiet life now, hiding in a small town in Oregon where nobody knew her past. It had taken her 4 long years to put her life back together, to feel secure enough to trust another person, and to finally stop feeling like she was always in danger. But she never forgot what Garrett did to her. When she saw a news story about his current wife running away with their children, she knew she could not stay in hiding any longer. "I have spent years collecting evidence against him," Catherine explained, and her voice was filled with a calm determination. "I have proof of everything, but I have always been too afraid to go to the police by myself." Meredith then asked the one question that was on her mind. "So why did you decide to call me now?" Catherine's response was simple and clear. "Because you were the first woman who ever fought back against him. The other women before you just disappeared. I was hoping that if we worked together, we could finally stop him for good." They talked for 3 full hours on the phone that night. Catherine explained the incredible amount of evidence she had managed to gather. She described how Garrett used the same destructive tactics over and over, and how he used his network of powerful friends to protect himself. Then she shared a piece of information that made Meredith's blood run cold. "I was not the first one," Catherine admitted. "There was a woman named Patricia. After they were married for 2 years, he had her committed. And before Patricia, there was a young woman he was dating in college. She suddenly dropped out of school and moved far away, and she never told anyone why." Meredith felt a tight knot form in her stomach. "How many women were there?" Catherine paused for a moment. "The ones I can prove? There are at least 4 of them. But I am certain there are more," she added. A wave of sickness washed over Meredith. For all this time, so many women had been hurt, while Garrett went on with his life without facing any punishment. His money had created a system that allowed him to be cruel. "So what do we do next?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We go to the only person who has been trying to bring him down for years." 2 days after that phone call, Meredith was sitting in a simple government building in Hartford. She was there to meet a woman named Patricia Cole, an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose sharp, tired eyes looked like they had seen everything. Agent Cole looked directly at Meredith and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, I have spent the last 6 years trying to build a case against your husband. I have investigated him for everything from financial fraud and tax evasion to obstruction of justice. But every time I get close, something goes wrong. my witnesses suddenly disappear, or they change their entire story. Critical evidence just vanishes into thin air, and somehow the judges always seem to rule in his favor. Meredith needed to be sure. She asked, "So you have no doubt that he is a criminal?" The agent's answer was grim. "I have no doubt he is a very dangerous man who has very powerful friends." "Then why has he never been arrested?" Agent Cole leaned forward slightly. "Because there is a big difference between knowing something and being able to prove it in a court of law. To do that, I need people who are willing to come forward and testify. And so far, no one has been brave enough to do it," Meredith said, finishing the agent's thought. She thought about her two beautiful children, Emmett and Nora. In the painful 2 hours, she was allowed to see them each week. She thought about Eleanor, her mother-in-law, with her smug and satisfied expression. She thought about her husband's new girlfriend, Vanessa, with her hand resting on her pregnant belly. A new kind of fire began to burn inside of Meredith. "I am not going to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice filled with a new strength. For the next 3 weeks, they all worked almost together, nonstop, to build their case. Agent Cole and Catherine put together a timeline of a decade's worth of criminal behavior. Meredith even agreed to wear a hidden recording device during her visits with the children, capturing conversations that would reveal Garrett's true nature to the world. The plan they came up with was incredibly smart and simple. Meredith would be the one to make contact with Garrett. She would pretend that she was completely broken and ask for a private meeting to discuss her surrender. She knew his enormous ego would not let him miss a chance to see her admit defeat. He would arrive expecting to find a shattered woman, begging him to take her back. But he was not going to meet a shattered woman. He was walking directly into a perfectly designed trap. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at a hotel suite in Stamford. Meredith chose the room herself, making sure it had clear acoustics and many places to hide tiny cameras. She arrived early, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind was perfectly clear and focused. In the hotel suite right next door, Agent Cole and her team were already set up, listening to every sound. When Garrett walked into the room, he looked exactly as she remembered him. He was dressed perfectly and radiated a feeling of complete confidence, like a man who had never lost. "You wanted to see me?" he said. It was a statement, not a question. He sat down in a large armchair with the easy comfort of a person who had won every battle he had ever fought. "So, speak." Meredith took a seat on the couch across from him. She clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. "I just want to have my children back," she said, making her voice sound small and weak. "I miss them." A cold, cruel smile appeared on his face. "Then it is time for you to end this foolishness. Come back home and start to remember your place." "My place?" she repeated, almost in a whisper. He let out a soft chuckle. That smile once made her feel like the luckiest woman alive. Now Meredith saw it was just a hunter's camouflage. "You were always just a decoration," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. "You were a pretty thing for my arm, a good mother for my children, and a wife who knew her place. But you got greedy, Mary. You wanted things you didn't earn, like respect, or a voice, and I will never, ever share my power." Meredith felt the tiny microphone taped against her skin, recording every hateful word he spoke. "And what about Colleen?" she asked softly. "Did she want power too?" His whole expression changed in a single heartbeat. The confident smile was gone. Something cold and terrifying took its place. "How do you know that name?" he hissed. "I know everything about her, Garrett. I know what happened to her." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Colleen was weak, just like you. She couldn't accept her role in life, so I had to remove her. If you keep pushing me, I promise you will vanish in exactly the same way." "Is that a threat?" she asked. "Yeah, it is a fact," he answered. Meredith nodded, slowly and deliberately. She looked straight at the large mirror on the far wall, knowing a camera was hidden behind the glass. "I think that is everything we need," she said, her voice suddenly loud and firm. Just then, The door of the hotel suite crashed open. The room was instantly filled with federal agents. For the first time in his charmed life, Garrett Caldwell looked completely and totally afraid. His arrest became the biggest news story in the country. Television stations played the recording over and over again. Everyone saw Garrett being led out of the Stamford Hotel in handcuffs, his face a mixture of shock and rage. The images were everywhere. They were discussed on morning news shows and shared millions of times on the internet. Headlines flashed from every screen. Billionaire manager arrested by federal agents, the fall of a Wall Street king, and more women speak out in Caldwell case. The list of official charges against him was long and serious. It covered everything from financial fraud and tax crimes to a conspiracy to violate human rights. The whole story broke wide open after Catherine bravely told her story. Then Patricia and two other women Meredith didn't even know also came forward. This was bigger than just one man's horrible behavior. It became a moment of truth for the entire nation. Agent Cole warned Meredith that the court battle would be tough. She said Garrett's expensive lawyers would use every dirty trick they could think of. But a certain kind of justice arrived quickly, long before any trial began. Just 3 days after Garrett was arrested, his girlfriend Vanessa Holt was stopped at an airport. She was trying to get on a private plane to the Cayman Islands. She had $200,000 worth of jewelry and a purse filled with cash. She was arrested for having stolen property. She was then walked through the crowded airport wearing the very same designer shoes she had shown off at the custody hearing. Her arrest photo, with mascara running down her tear-stained face and her eyes wide with fear, appeared in the news right next to Garrett's. What about the pregnancy she had so cruelly used against Meredith? It was completely fake. Medical documents proved Vanessa made up the whole thing to trap a wealthy man who was now a national disgrace. In the meantime, Eleanor Caldwell stayed hidden in her enormous mansion, refusing to talk to the press or anyone. Her busy social calendar was suddenly empty. The powerful friends who used to plead for her dinner party invitations were now not answering her phone calls. The Caldwell name, which once meant power and high class, was now nothing more than a punchline and a warning. For Meredith, however, only one victory truly mattered. It came 6 weeks later in a courtroom. This room felt like a different universe from the one where she had lost so much. A new judge, a woman named Patricia Winters, was in charge. She had a reputation for being tough, but also fair. She went over all the new evidence very carefully. She heard the powerful stories from Agent Cole, Catherine, and the other women. She watched the video from the hidden hotel camera, which showed Garrett clearly threatening Meredith's life. After all of that, she gave her final decision. This court gives full and complete custody of the children, Emmett and Nora Caldwell, to their mother, Meredith Caldwell. Mr. Garrett Caldwell is not allowed any visits or communication until his criminal case is over. Also, this court demands the immediate unfreezing of all family money and provides financial payment for the emotional harm done to the mother. The words sounded like they came from a beautiful dream. Full custody. Her money was returned. She received damages. She did it. She had actually won. Her lawyer, Suzanne, squeezed her hand so hard that it almost hurt. Meredith could hear the quiet talking of people in the courtroom behind her, but she paid no attention. Her eyes were fixed on the courtroom door. An officer was leading two small children in identical sweaters through it. Emmett saw her first. A huge, happy smile lit up his face. He started to wiggle in the officer's arms, reaching out for her with his little hands. "Mama!" he yelled as loud as he could. "Mama!" It was the first word he had ever spoken. He said it again and again, like a happy little song. "Mama, mama, mama!" In a flash, Meredith was across the room. She gathered both her children in a tight hug as a huge sob of relief shook her entire body. Nora pushed her face into her mother's shoulder, her small fingers getting caught in her hair. "I am here," Meredith whispered to them, with her own happy tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am here, my darlings, and I swear I will never let you go again." The next few months were not always easy, because healing takes a lot of time. Meredith and her children moved to a small, quiet town on the coast of Maine. It was a place far away from the bad memories of Greenwich. She purchased a sweet little house with a lovely view of the ocean. It was much smaller than the mansion she escaped from, but this house belonged only to her. She also went back to work, using her skills as an accountant to help other women find money during their own tough divorces. Her new life was simple. The money she earned was only a small part of the fortune Garrett's company made, but her job now had a deep purpose. Her twins, Emmett and Nora, began to grow up as all children should. They took their first steps together on a sandy beach as the sun went down. They spoke their first full sentences to one another, while surrounded by moving boxes in their new home. This was a house where they learned to laugh and cry and feel totally safe. It was a home where no one ever shouted, no doors were ever slammed, and their mother did not have to cry in secret anymore. But Meredith still had bad dreams sometimes. She always checked the locks 3 times before she went to bed, and she still felt a rush of fear if a man walked by wearing expensive cologne. Every now and then, she would see a face in a crowd that looked like Garrett. But she was getting stronger. The journey to healing was slow and not perfect. But she was on that path every single day. One lovely afternoon in the early spring, she sat on her porch, watching Emmett and Nora run after seagulls on the beach. A pickup truck drove up, and a man carrying a toolbox got out. His name was Owen Hartley. He was a local carpenter and a widower. He had kind eyes and hands that were rough from years of hard work. He also had a little girl named Sophie, who was the same age as her twins. He was there to fix a loose railing on her porch that had been shaky since she moved in. Owen did not ask about her past. He didn't ask for any stories or explanations. He just repaired the porch railing and then played tag with her kids in the sand for a whole hour. Before he left, he asked if he could possibly come by again another time. "I would like that very much," Meredith said, and the words felt completely true in her heart. Just then, her phone buzzed with a news update. She looked at the headline. It said, "Garrett Caldwell sentenced to 12 years in federal prison." She felt nothing at all. Meredith put her phone away and looked back at her children, at the ocean, and at the kind man who smiled at her as he packed up his tools. The old thoughts still haunted her. He had taken everything. Garrett had stolen her trust and her sense of safety. He destroyed her faith that the world could be a good place. But he could never take her children, and he could never, ever break her spirit. From inside his truck, Owen offered a final wave goodbye. His daughter, a little girl named Sophie, pressed her face to the window. Her tiny hand waved back and forth at the twins. In that moment, Emmett came running up the sandy trail, his shoes kicking up little puffs of dust. "Mommy," he called out, his voice filled with pure excitement. "Mommy, you have to see what I found." He held out a simple, ordinary seashell, as if it were a priceless treasure. His face lit up with absolute joy. Something deep within Meredith settled then. It was not a loud victory, but a quiet, powerful feeling of calm. She was finally at peace. She pulled her son into a hug and kissed his sandy cheek. "Oh, my sweet boy, it is completely perfect," she whispered to him. "Let's go down to the water and see if we can find more." They joined hands and walked toward the waves. The tide was slowly coming in, washing the beach clean with every soft crash. The future opened up in front of them, as vast and endless as the great ocean itself. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Meredith Caldwell was not afraid of it.